Hello, everyone. My name is Ellie Gettinger. I'm the education director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and I am here to round out the week with a museum moment for you. And this is a museum moment that I called in some favors from a fabulous intern we have, Emma, and my colleague Jay, to really help pull together some of these pieces. And as I was working on this museum moment about the Free Soviet Jewry movement, I realized that this could be a whole free Soviet Jewry series. So I have a feeling I'm going to come back to this topic again. And today is going to be more of a thumbnail sketch of a broad movement. And we're going to start a conversation here about advocacy and activism and grassroots versus diplomacy and how all of these different pieces came together to create an international movement. So as a start, just because I'm guessing that for some people here, they're going to need a little bit of a reminder, not necessarily for everyone, but for some, that in the 1950s, there had been kind of prevalent anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union throughout its incarnation. Trotsky, all of these different pieces. And I'm really going broad here. And in the early 1950s, at the end of Stalin's life, there's this thing called the doctor's plot, where he says that the specific doctor was doing malpractice in order to kill prominent leaders in the in the Communist Party. And this becomes a bigger plot that then takes in all of these other doctors, and they are transported to Siberia with no evidence. And it comes up in all of this documentation. There's actually no evidence of this. And it's one of these things that is ongoing. There's supposedly actually some contemplation of having some mass deportations of Jews. And remember, this is like 1951. So you're literally less than a decade at the end of World War II and the Holocaust. And Stalin is kind of working in this universe. He dies in 1953 before any of these big major things could come about, but there were a number of doctors who were sent to Siberia and tortured. And then this is, so there's this public outcry a bit about this. And then there's this kind of ongoing anti-Jewish sentiment. And as we jump into this part of the story, I want to, just talk about some of that anti-Jewish sentiment. That there's all sorts of things that are going on. This, for instance, is a very popular book, Judaism Without Embellishment, in the Soviet Union at the time. You can see from this image that the guy is, got a tallis on, and he has a pile of money in his hand. So it's working on those same tropes of the Jew as the moneylender, the Jew as the greedy, controlling magnate of industry, the Jew as in communist Russia as the person who is anti-communism. And this was a very popular book at the time. There is, a degree of outcry in the United States and in some Western places, but it kind of is, there's just low levels. In 1965, over Rosh Hashanah, over actually the high holidays, Elie Wiesel is sent to the Soviet Union to report on what's happening with Jews in the Soviet Union. And out of this trip, this book comes out. It's called The Jews of Silence. And he ends the book with this statement: "What torments me most is not the Jews of silence I met in Russia, but the silence of the Jews I live among today." And Elie Wiesel at this point has written Night. And in fact, he talks about how he is inspired by the Jewish people that he meets in the Soviet Union who actually are risking their lives by having copies of Night in their houses. And he is making a profound statement to say, we as a Jewish community, we as an American, Americans, we as an international community altogether need to look out for the Jews of the Soviet Union, especially in light of the Holocaust. And I, as one of the primary spokespeople of Holocaust survivors, am making a statement here. And this becomes a rallying cry for American Jews. And many people say that this was kind of a big turning point for them in their understanding of what was going on in the Soviet Union. One of the big challenges is if you tried to practice your religion, if you tried to immigrate, you would be released from your job. You might also be deported to Siberia or sent to some sort of heavy labor work situation. And this grouping of people, the people who weren't allowed to leave the country, but also weren't allowed to work or have, and were imprisoned, were called refuseniks. And so this becomes kind of a big platform of the movement. And the movement, in one of the things that I loved in kind of reading and developing my understanding, is just how broad this is. You see major organizations through federations and JCRCs taking point, and then you see student response, and you see from kind of all ends of the Jewish spectrum getting involved and working together. And yes, there's skirmishes and battles about, you have, Meir Kahan, who thinks you need to, actually fight fire with fire, and does kind of active resistance, versus, students holding vigils in front of the Soviet embassy every week for 20 years. And all sorts of activism is going on in this movement. And you see people with, extreme, you see big marches like this. This one's from the 1970s. I believe there were about 4 Milwaukeeans who went to this march in DC. And you see all of these pieces with this constant sense of we need to apply pressure. And the American government actually responds in some, interesting ways. The Jackson-Vanik resolution amendment is a statement that says we're not going to have trade with communist countries if they refuse to let people immigrate, which was specifically designed to respond to what was happening with Soviet Jewry. You have a lot of this kind of action going on, and it comes from the applied pressure of this massive, different coalition of Jewish groups coming together to respond to a specific issue. In the 1980s, there's this continued pressure, and it comes to a head with a big march in DC. And in fact, I read this march was the brainchild of Natan Sharansky, who is the former chair of Jaffe. He's probably the most well-known of the refuseniks, and he becomes kind of the spokesperson for this movement. And after he's released from prison and comes to America and sets about creating a kind of a big mobilization, and he keeps saying, we need to have a march, we need to have something. And there's a real sense by the organized Jewish community that this would be embarrassing if we don't get the numbers, if it doesn't look like there are enough people in support. But his plan is pushed forward because Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, has a meeting on December 6th with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. And there's this statement, if Gorbachev is coming to the United States, that we need to make a big statement. So they get together all sorts of groups. In the 5 weeks that they have to plan this, Sharansky visits 30 cities. It's amazing. And this actually is an article that appeared in the Chronicle in which it actually previews this, but there are a number of community members who were talking about going to the march, including Marty Stein, who is in the center of this picture. Marty Stein, who was at that point the national chairman of the United Jewish Appeal, which is kind of the central federation body at that point, says that last week Stein was among a small delegation of U.S. Jewish leaders that discussed the rally with Reagan and Secretary of State George Shultz, a White House meeting. Stein said the commitment of the president and the Secretary of State to make this a front burner issue is historic. So there's this real sense of movement then, and over 250,000 people come to this march, which, if you think about it, it's 5 weeks to plan, and they galvanize in DC at this time. It's a really big statement of Jewish community organization in this moment. With that said, the coda of this is a little bit like, yes, there's all this pressure, and people suddenly, there is movement, and immigration happens, and a lot of that comes from the people. But the real thing that opened the floodgates was the fall of the Soviet Union, which then allowed the people who lived in the Soviet Union to make choices about where they could go. And, many of them did choose to come to the United States. Many chose to go to Israel. And in some future session, I really want to look at that process of how people were resettled and what worked out, because I think one of the things that also is happening at the same time that you have this political push is this sense of developing community and pulling people in and trying to build a community for people who are coming to Milwaukee. So you have both this sense of activism and saying we need people to come, but also this sense of ownership that if we're saying these people need to have the right to come to the United States, we need to be able to respond to their needs once they get here. I look at this at the end of a crazy week. There have been so many protests and so many things going on. And I see here that Robin Cohen says that she was on the Federation plane that went to DC for the demonstration. I think there were about 200 people. So I'm excited to have her as part of that living history. As we're in the end of this crazy week, I just want to think about the power of people coming together and overcoming differences and saying, yes, these are the issues that we need to tackle, and looking at how we use our political capital and saying that there's so much to be done, and that we as a group of people from all sorts of different backgrounds who may be watching this, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to take action. Thank you so much for joining me for this museum moment. My name is Ellie Gettinger. Once again, this is Jewish Museum Milwaukee. If you've enjoyed this museum moment or any of our museum moments, please feel free to make a donation at jewishmuseummilwaukee.org. And we'll be back next week looking at kind of we're reclaiming voices and stories that maybe people don't know about. Shabbat Shalom.